Thank you, Yoel, and thanks to the organizing committee for inviting me to speak here. And I would like to basically build on what has been already said here, and I suspect this talk may be a prelude to things that will be said in the two following talks, and talk about when does the archaeological record begin. The desert obviously is a very good place to discuss this, to contemplate this issue, and that's where the work I'm relating to has been conducted. So because I'm the first one talking about culture and material culture, so some definitions first. Some of them are trivial. Archaeology is the study of human history, or in our case, prehistory, from the material culture remains, the physical things that are left in the ground. Prehistory specifically has the privilege of being the sole player, basically, in this field, because nobody can tell us this is not so. Well, we can tell each other. We do that quite a lot, but we are it. We excavate the evidence. We analyze the evidence. There's no historical record that can contest it or support it or explain it. So we have to come up with the evidence and the explanations. And with the term material culture, which may be more specific here, I mean objects, tools of any raw material. And these could be structures, they can be art, or any other things that are made by humans, that we can specifically say that they were made by humans. So by these definitions, we say that the archaeological record starts with the first tool making. And here you can see some of the very first tools known today. The second stipulation for our understanding of the archaeological record is that these tools have to be recognized by us as made by humans. So we have within our definitions, there's the ontological knowledge that things started when people started making tools, but epistemologically we are constrained by what we can discover, what we can recognize. Itay basically has done a lot of this work for me, thank you. So talking about chronology, archaeology is often associated and sometimes equals for many the issue of chronology. So by the Oxford English Dictionary, chronology is the science of measuring, of computing dates. This is not quite exactly so. You can see here two types of chronologies. Itay talked about them, the relative and absolute chronologies. So absolute chronologies are the ones that where the data are not dependent on anything else. They can provide the chronology by themselves. The relative chronologies depend on the interrelationship between any components or any elements that we are looking at in order to define a structure of time. And we have systems and methods already discussed again to measure time by any of these two big categories of time. And this is the chronology of the early excuse me, material culture. So we start on the left with the early discoveries, and by the 1970s to early 1990s, the earliest archaeological record, the earliest stone tools that were known were about 1.8, 1.7 million years. This is the short that we use normally. And this was defined and discovered and defined in the site named Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, hence the name Oldovan for this very simple, so it seemed at the time, very simple material culture. In the early 1990s, the age of the archaeological record went farther back in time by about, 700,000 years old to 2.6 from sites that were found in Ethiopia, and still the Oldovan. We didn't see any big changes between what was defined in Tanzania and what was defined in these early sites in Ethiopia, so they're still going under this same name of a technological complex. And just 2 years ago, in Kenya, there was a single site, Lomekwi, which I don't think still yet deserves a techno-complex definition. So it's a single complex, a single site, sorry, and the date is 3.3 to the 3.3 million years old. So another 700,000 years back in time. What's next in terms of the chronology? It's anybody's guess. I don't know when the next discovery will be done. John talked about this as basically surprises are out there. And what the date of this will be is, again, anybody's guess. I would say that when the 2.6 million years tools were discovered, people suspected that they were not the first one. So this was kind of predicted that earlier things will be found. I don't think anybody expected that they will be as early as that. When we go to 3.3 million years, and you can see the artifact that I chose to show, things are getting really messy in the sense that these look less and less clear in the sense that we can recognize them as human-made. They look more and more natural, and we either may be nearing the time when things were used without any modification by humans, or we may come nearing the point in time where things were made, but in such a simple way that we archaeologists cannot understand that it was done by humans. So I'm predicting that there will be a plateau. At some point, we will reach a stage where we cannot tell whether it's human-made or not, and we'll have to stop there in terms of looking backwards in time. One more thing that I would like to say, and that's again building on, I think, the last slides that John showed, hominins, our family, had been around from about between 7 and 6 million years ago. At least currently, we place the earliest stone tools about halfway through the hominin story. So the earliest hominin, as far as we can tell now, were not stone tool makers. They're not making a material culture that was preserved archaeologically. They may have been using tools that did not preserve. And so another constraint of our understanding of the deep archaeological time, or the depths of our chronology, is in fact again, what time hides, and in this case, what time destroys, which is the organic material of which many of these artifacts may have been made, and we cannot find them simply because they're not preserved. So we are basically we're constrained at looking at stone tools as the indications of early material culture. So this was about chronology. But chronology, and again, I think we heard a little bit about it, chronology is one aspect of time. It's an aspect of measuring one way or another time. It's linear. It's perceived as a linear process. It has discrete units that can be broken down. And in many ways, it's restrictive of our thinking, because there are scales of time, probably, that are not exactly linear and do not really fit or do not help us tell a better story about the beginning of the archaeological record. So following the changes that were made, well, obviously in modern physics, but also in history, where the annales d'histoire, the conception of different time scales, looking at long and medium and short time scales which act on different aspects and create or define different aspects of human societies. This may be a multi-system, non-linear aspects or scales or perceptions of time may be helpful when we are trying to not just tell when archaeology or when the archaeological record started, but also how it evolved, the tempo of change or tempo or lack of change, and things like this. So we need different scales of time, and these different scales are interactive in the sense that one can influence the other. And these are the scales that I would like to look at today. So we already talked about what is the beginning of the archaeological record in principle and what it is in practice. And of course, again, now we are talking about what is it that makes the archaeological record visible to us. So we already mentioned stone tools. These are, again, the very early stone tools from Lomekwi, the 3.3 stone tools. I bet not many of them would bend down to pick them up and look at them again. They look like really ugly stones, but they are not. Well, they're ugly, but they are not simple stones. And the things that I would like, another stipulation or caveat or complication that I would like to add here is that the beginning of material culture is not necessarily, and again, this is something that we know, and in practice, it's of course a very different story, do not necessarily coincide with the material record or the archaeological record as we know it. Because to create an archaeological record that is visible to the archaeologist, there are several conditions that have to be met. And I would revert for a minute to chimpanzees, closest relatives. And when we look at the modern chimpanzees, they do many things, but some behaviors that are illuminating in order to, for me, to understand the formation of archaeological sites are the ones that I'm showing here. Chimpanzees nest in trees, so they go to sleep up in the trees. They prepare the nests. They pull and push and twine some twigs and branches. They make a lot of mess that obviously falls down the trees. The sleeping places are pretty constant. They go back to the same places. So over a time, they can be there for days or for a week or 2 weeks, that they go back and forth and they come again to the same nesting places. They create a lot of debris under the trees. So basically they are creating some sort of residue that, if it preserved, we could call archaeology, but it does not. Chimpanzees do leave some material remains that are persistent, that is survive through time, and these are the debris of nut cracking by stones. So they use stone tools. They don't make them, but they use them, and they create an archaeological record. This is something that actually people have gone out and excavated chimpanzee nut cracking sites, and you can see an archaeological record there. So I'm using this as an analogy. I don't think we can use the chimpanzees as a homology, but this is an analogy that I would like to think about when I'm thinking about the first sites. These are places on the landscape to which people came sufficient times or on sufficient occasions to do whatever activities they were doing in this place. And what makes them an archaeological place, an archaeological site for us, is the fact that the people were using the stone tools habitually, often, in big quantities, and leaving them there as concentration. So this for us is, as you can see in the photo on the left here, this is the archaeological site. It is a place on a landscape, an ancient landscape that we are excavating now, that where people left stone tools like the ones you see on the right corner there. Again, cobbles and flakes, a very simple material culture. And as I said, the earliest archaeological assemblages in the earliest archaeological sites are really simple core, cobble and flake industry. Simple may be the wrong word here. You can see here a bunch of students with a big bunch of cobbles. They are trying to make flakes. It's not so easy, apparently. But nonetheless, the technology is very simple. It's not very complicated. And basically, the process of making the early stone tools is consists of basically 3 stages that would be, or 2 actually, the procurement of raw material from a nearby source, and the napping of flakes of this big cobble. So you have a hammerstone, you have a cobble, and you hit the cobble at specific angles. There is some knowledge involved, and that's why people thought that these sites are not the earliest ones. But it's a simple chain of, a very short chain of operations, and this is what creates the record that we observe. So some case studies that will illustrate how we go about trying to elucidate time from the inanimate, basically, material record here. So this is from the site of Hadar in northern Ethiopia, where I've been working with Yoel for quite a while. And this is the younger part of the Hadar sequence. I hope you can see, whoops, what's the thing? The two archaeological sites here, named AL666 and AL894. What is shown here is a geological marker, a tephra, a volcanic ash layer that can be dated with isotopic methods, and the date is 2.36 million years. So these two sites are slightly older than the tuff, so we put them at some point between 2.4 and 2.3 million years. Another thing that we can say, based on the stratigraphy, the positioning in stratigraphic column, is that one of the sites is earlier than the other, although when you look at it here, it's not really obvious, but through some geological work, you can show that these sites are not exactly of the same time. Where do we place these? So this is the chronology, and now I would like to broaden this chronology to a larger area in order to be able to talk about the Oldovan as such, this early techno-complex. I'm showing you here a map of sub-Saharan East Africa, and I've indicated dates of the archaeological sites known from this area. So we have here the oldest one, a single occupation, 3.3, but you will see that we have one area where we have 2.6 million sites, two sites basically, not that many. Quite a bunch of sites. So these are sites, and within each site we have localities, so specific points on the landscape where you get the archaeology. So we have a bunch of sites here that are dating to about 2.4. There are some here. I showed you two. showed them to you. Another bunch here at the Omo, in southern Ethiopia, and West Turkana, another bunch. So all in all, other things, other sites indicated here are younger, Olduvai, Kanjera, Fejej, or do not have stone tool remains. While the earliest that we know of is 3.3 million years old, it's a single occurrence. We cannot really say much about a single occurrence, so I'm going to the next oldest, now the next oldest, a bunch of sites. So I'm talking about probably 20, somewhere between 20 and 30 localities in these four major research areas. And with this bigger sample, we have maybe, or beginning to have some sufficient points in time that we can discuss process, we can discuss tempo of changing the material culture, and maybe even address human behavior not on the big evolutionary long durée, the long time cycle, but maybe on a smaller scale of time. Oops, sorry. So short tempo, I'm showing here the two scales that I think are pertinent, or that we can learn something about from the evidence I will show you. So on the short scale, I would like to say that the sites, the Oldovan sites that we know, are pretty short and discrete episodes of human activity. In almost all the sites dating to 2.4 to between 2.4 and 2.3 million, we have what we call refits. You have an example here. You have a much more extravagant example here. So refits are basically when you as an archaeologist find in the site the flakes that were taken off the cobbles. Oftentimes you can fit them back together in order to see how the whole thing started. So basically we can rewind time in a sense. So this is one big cobble, and we can see how many flakes are refitting onto it. I can tell you because this is my work, 34. The center of it, the cobble itself is missing. It's not at the site. This is from a site in Kenya, locally 2A, where the they have many, many refits. This is not the only one in Ethiopia, in the other sites as well, but we have many, many refits, many, many cores, the flakes taken off from which fit back together again. And that suggests several things to me. First, that we are looking at some, not many, although we have a large number of artifacts, we're looking at a really small number of cobbles that were flaked. So specific and rather discrete episode. And the other thing that is relevant here is that each of those sites where we find the refits had been disturbed a little bit in time, but was covered relatively fast, because otherwise we will not be finding things. They will be washed away, they will be trampled on by animals or other people and so on, and they will not be preserved as the way they are. So we are looking at short occupation or short activity episodes, and we are looking at relative fast burial of the site, sealing, protecting them from any disturbance. So how short is short? This is not always easy to answer in the short time span of 100,000 years, so between 2.4 and 2.3, how short is short? At least in some instances, we can get an idea about this. I'm showing you here a landscape archaeology project that we did in Hadar with students in, I think, 2009, and we went about this basin where we had the two archaeological sites with two questions. First, how many sites are there in the basin that are hidden by the sediments that we did not find? The answer, based on our 10 or 12 trenches around the basin, is none. We found the two only sites in this area. And the second question was, what can we say about the environment of this site? So we step trenched in several places. This is the work of the students, and the team geologists compiled and combined all the profiles that we see in these trenches, and suggested a depositional environment. The sites were close to a river, and they were sitting just on the bank of a river. You can see it by the changes in the sediment. The water flows out and in, covers the site, and so on. And there is a reconstruction of the particular system, riverine system, that created this kind of environment. You can see here the harder sites. The Gona sites are very near to it. And the suggestion is that we are looking at sites that are in a specific geomorphic context. It's called the crevasse play, where actually the main river, the axial river, flows and deposits sediments along the banks, sometimes even covering some of the tributaries. And based on the modern analog of the Omo River in Ethiopia, we know that this is something that happens on a very short time scale, actually, 10 to 100 years. So the site, the Oldovan site, that is somewhere between 2.4 and 2.3 million years ago, existed between 10 and 100 years at most. So this is pretty good, considering the vast space or temporal space that we are investigating here. So we can narrow things and we can talk about very specific activities. Another short-term, short temporal scale that we would like to look at is what did the individual who made these stone tools know or perceive or understand or acted on in relation to time? And we are looking at two indications from the material culture record here. One is the selection of raw material. We know that in all the Oldovan sites of this age, people went to very nearby sources of raw material. So these would be the river channels where they can pick up the cobbles and use them. Here we can see how this sampling is done, and classification, in this case, according to shapes. And what we know is that in all these sites, there is a selection. People I'll say at 894, in these 50 years I'm averaging here, or cutting in the middle, the 50 years that they occupied the site, and the same goes for the other people, other hominins occupying other sites of this time. They did not just pick things in random. They were selective because they were aiming to do something. So they selected according to shape, size, convenience of fitting into the hand. John talked about the hand. People have to hold things in hand, so that it cannot be huge, it cannot be too small because you'll bang your fingers and things like this. So there is a selection that some of it is really mechanical, so size and weight maybe, but other elements of the selection are intentional in the sense that they are picking for good raw material, for specific shapes of the core, and this holds for Hadar in one way, for Lokalili in another way, for Gona. So all the sites that we know of this time period show very clear selection of raw material. So people who went to pick up the cobbles had some perception of what they are going to do. They had a plan for the future. Maybe it was for the next 10 minutes, but still it was something that they contemplated to the future. Another aspect that we can deduce from the record here is the issue of transport. This is a diagram showing the formation processes of a site, and I'm not going to go into it because obviously it's very simple, and I just tried to narrow it down and say that sites were sealed very fast, so not all of these applied to many of the sites I'm talking about, but this is important. There is transport by hominids of stuff out of the site. And when we look at the refits, and we see that in almost all the sites, some parts of the cobbles were napped, and flakes, the products were taken out, or the cobbles, the core, the remaining raw material was also taken out. So people are napping stones, they are making stone tools, and they are taking some of the artifacts to another place on the landscape. We have not yet been able, as far as I know, anywhere to find refits between two Oldovan sites. So we don't know if they're going another 300 meters, 2 kilometers, in which direction, what motivated the movement. But they do plan in the selection and they do plan in the transport. They have some future goal in sight. And so very carefully, I would like to suggest that we are already seeing, probably not quite by definition, and probably Adin will have something to say about that too, but we are looking at the beginnings of the rudimentary beginnings of mental time travel already expressed here in what we see here. So I will try now to move to a higher or broader scale. And if we look at the sites that I discussed, the bunch of sites that I discussed, in red here are the sites that are relevant to our discussion. You will remember that each of them contains several localities. So there's maybe 20, 30 that we know of. You can time it by 100, by 1,000. We know that the sites represent short episodes of activity, most of them, and we know that at least some of the sites are of very short duration. So this, to me, suggests that if you look at the space, the spatial scale of Africa, the scale is not here, but this is about almost 3,000 kilometers. If you look at the spatial scale, and if you look at the temporal scale, 100,000 years, Jesus Christ was 2,000 years ago, so that's old stuff already. Just make this kind of a yardstick. We are looking at groups of hominins, I don't know who they were, that are very sparse on the landscape, that had obviously opportunities to connect, but maybe not very opportunities to connect. If we add on top of this the issue of a very small, simple technology that once you get the knack of it, is not so easy to reproduce and do again, and it's not so difficult to do again and again. And perhaps what we should suggest is that the archaeological record, at least that we can stand behind, of 2.6 million years old, maybe it was created from fresh It was reinvented more time and again until the system, the demographic system, stabilizes and allows more connection and more transmission of information, and that's, I think that happens at about 1.8, 1.9, where we actually do see some changes in the material culture. So for the first, or the 700,000 years between 2.6 and 1.8, there's really very little change in the old Uvan, and even after, but then we had additional elements added to it. So looking at the archaeological record and where it begins, chronologically we have a date. I'm saying where does the archaeological record begin, not where did it begin, because apparently it's still happening. We just keep pushing it back and back in time. Historically, as we discussed, the archaeological record and the record and the material culture are not necessarily one and the same. And as I said, maybe the material culture or some aspects of material culture may have been invented time and again. And the last thing that I want to comment on and actually ask a question that I'm sure many of you are asking is how is all this relevant to our life today? And I think basically through the convoluted march of time, flux of time, flow of time, stone tool chips led to these chips. Technology is us, and it makes us lacking a lot of time, just run out of time all the time. Thank you.